Hong Kong's position as an international financial center has made it one of the most successful cities in the world. Yet a series of incidents since 2019, including the outbreak of COVID-19, as well as the deteriorating Sino-US relations, has raised the question of whether Hong Kong can uphold its status as an international financial center. In the following presentation, Joseph Yam, former chief executive of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, shares his views on how internal and external crises will impact Hong Kong's financial and monetary systems, and suggests strategies to be implemented in the face of future challenges.
I've been asked to speak about the outlook of Hong Kong as an international financial center, and I would like actually to start with a rather fundamental point. You may think that this is rather too basic for you, but please bear with me. In the financial world, there are two types of people. One with money to spare, the investors, including depositors, and the other wanting to borrow money, wanting to raise money, the fundraisers. Now, if it is possible to mobilize money from those who have it to those in need of it, then the economy prospers. Now, unfortunately, the risk appetite of the investors and the risk profiles of the fundraisers differ. And there is a mismatch. And therefore, you need somebody in between, which is the financial system, to mobilize that money on behalf of these people. And in mobilizing it, they have to do what I call the 3 T's of financial intermediation: transforming risk, transferring risk, and transacting risk. Now, the banks obviously transform risk from the ability of the borrower to repay money into the risk of the bank in repaying depositors. That's a transformation of risk. And when a financial institution organizes, let's say, a debt issue by a borrower, the financial institution therefore transfers the risk from the borrower to the investor. And the transaction of risk, which is very important, is to provide liquidity, like the stock market. You have buy and sell a particular stock so that in the primary market, money can be mobilized from investors into those who are raising money through IPOs. Now, that's the role of the financial system, a very fundamental role. If you are doing that on an international dimension, which is necessary because we would want investors to be able to diversify their investment opportunities, and for fundraisers to diversify their funding sources on an international dimension. And therefore, internationalizing financial intermediation is very important. It's very efficient, actually, for a particular economy. So if you're doing that on an international basis, that's international financial activity. That's what we are specializing in Hong Kong. And if you're talking about the international dimension of finance, you are realistically talking about the mainland of China and the rest of the world. All right? So this is what we as an international financial center should focus on. Unfortunately, there are so many rankings and labels out there in the market trying to promote financial business instead of focusing on the need for finance to support the economy. But we, Hong Kong, as an international financial center, should really stay focused. Now, I believe that the Hong Kong SAR government has a policy stance that has this sort of focus. On the monetary side, for example, we have a fixed exchange rate. The US dollar is the international currency, is the medium of transaction internationally. To carry out international financial transactions, most of them use the US dollar. And if the Hong Kong dollar is linked to the US dollar very firmly, using a very robust monetary system, Hong Kong dollar is as good as the US dollar, then international investors and fundraisers would feel at ease to operate in Hong Kong, isn't it? So monetary policy, we've got the right monetary policy. On the financial side, there is what I call a light touch policy, giving the market to take the initiative to do what they think should be done, all right? But with a very strong focus, as I mentioned earlier, on the need for finance to be supporting the economy. Now, when I was at the HKMA, I was responsible also for banking supervision. I often just asked the bank, go ahead and do whatever you think is bearing in mind this particular focus of financial intermediation in support of the economy. And sometimes they come back to the supervisors and ask rather silly questions, actually. Hey, should we be doing this or should we be doing that? But I would tell them that that's their business, all right? But on one occasion, I can tell you, there is a bank coming to me and say, there is this subprime mortgages that we would like to promote in Hong Kong. Should we be doing that? So I said, how is that going to help borrowers and fundraisers? And I asked the question, if it is subprime, why lend? So he went away quickly. Oh, another thing is that banks sometimes, or financial institutions sometimes, want to play the market. You know how these financial markets are? Many of them are actually zero-sum games, okay? And many people want to play in this zero-sum game, expecting to win day after day, quarter after quarter, year after year. How can you do that? Because if you win, others would lose. Now, this sort of activity, I really did not encourage. Because if you are going to win in a zero-sum game year after year, you must, first of all, be very lucky. I don't really want financial institutions to be operating on the basis of luck. You may have inside information, but that's really illegal, isn't it? And you can have sophisticated models to do all sorts of high-frequency trading in order to benefit, in order to gain money. But in this financial world, if you have a sophisticated model, it can be replicated by others in no time. That's why I discourage, this sort of what I call frills in the financial system. Be focused. Focus on what you are supposed to do. Now, the external environment that Hong Kong faces actually is quite beneficial to Hong Kong in our development as an international financial center. As I said, we are focusing on financial intermediation between the mainland of China and the rest of the world. The mainland of China is the second largest economy in the world with a very high savings rate and a balance of payment surplus, and therefore is an exporter of capital. On the other hand, the rest of the world, not knowing China that much hitherto, and if you look at the investment funds of this world, they are hugely underweight in investment in the second largest economy in the world. So there are investors, there are fundraisers wishing actually to do business between the mainland of China and the rest of the world. And Hong Kong is the place for them to congregate and do this sort of business. At the same time, obviously, the mainland of China is opening up. It's being rather cautious, rightly cautious about embracing financial globalization, and therefore the mainland of China needs an offshore market to conduct financial intermediation on that international dimension. So Hong Kong is the ideal place for doing just that. And as a result of successfully doing this over the years, you have these various channels of financial intermediation which have actually developed extremely well. Now, I don't know whether you know this, the banking sector of Hong Kong, in terms of its total assets, is almost 9 times of our GDP. For an economy of 7.5 million people, you don't really need that big a banking system. That's an indication of how international we are. We are serving the mainland of China. We're serving the rest of the world. We have been very, very successful in doing that. If you look also at the balance sheet of the banking system, almost 50% are external assets, and around the same sort of number are external liabilities. So we are very, very international. Now, on the equity market, I don't really have to mention. Such a small economy. And we put through the money from investors to IPO fundraisers, which is the largest in the world in absolute terms, not in relation to our GDP, but in absolute terms, we have been very, very successful. Relatively less successful is the debt market, but that's partly because we haven't actually been borrowing much money in Hong Kong. But we do have a very smooth benchmark yield curve as reference for whoever that wants to be raising debt in Hong Kong and in Hong Kong dollar. And now, obviously, we also have the renminbi debt market being developed in Hong Kong. So we have been very successful, okay, as an international financial center, focusing on doing things that support the economy. Of course, other than these three traditional channels of financial intermediation, we have other international financial activities, fund management, et cetera, et cetera. I wouldn't spend too much time on that. Now, to what we are facing. We have, in the past year or so, faced a number of shocks, the first one being social unrest. Now, I wouldn't want to go into detail about the cause of this social unrest. I think there are deep-rooted problems in Hong Kong in terms of the disparity of income and wealth in Hong Kong, in terms of the housing problem, which our Hong Kong Foundation has been doing quite a lot of works on those subjects. And unfortunately, on this social unrest, I think there are external forces involved, and spreading malicious rumors about our financial system, about our monetary system, et cetera, et cetera. But fortunately, so far so good. All those malicious rumors have not actually affected Hong Kong. Our international financial center status is intact as a result of the social unrest. But one very important point is that social unrest is actually affecting the safety of people in Hong Kong. Now, people in the financial system, financial talents, are very mobile. And if their personal safety has been affected, they may just go. So if this social unrest is not contained effectively, there is a danger that our status as an international financial center will be affected. Fortunately, of course, we have the national security law, which I think will form a basis, form the foundation of social order and safety returning to Hong Kong. Now, the second shock that we have experienced is obviously COVID-19. Now, again, I don't think this has a lot of impact on Hong Kong as an international financial center. COVID-19 has brought a sharp economic shock to Hong Kong. And that economic shock to Hong Kong has got to be handled. And the government is coming up with responses at the policy level. At the monetary level, fortunately, the US is implementing rather loose monetary policy, easy money. And that actually is appropriate for Hong Kong. And through our link to the US dollar, we have imported this easy monetary policy in Hong Kong, which fits our economic needs at the present time. On the fiscal side, we're running fairly large budget deficit, amounting to this year, it could well amount to 10% of GDP or 300 billion. Now, I'm not too worried about this because in Hong Kong, we have no official debt at all. The debt to GDP ratio is near zero. All right. Whatever debt that the government has issued or raised was for the purpose of developing the debt market, like green finance, Islamic bonds, et cetera, which is not for the purpose of funding budget deficits. So we have a very healthy fiscal position. And the whole purpose of accumulating reserves over the years, which now amounts to 1.1 trillion Hong Kong dollars of fiscal reserves, is to use those reserves in order to support the economy in very unusual times as now. I don't think the use of fiscal reserves to run budget deficit at this point of time would lead to any doubt about our fiscal and monetary discipline. Okay? If our fiscal and monetary disciplines remain intact, then Hong Kong's status as an international financial center would not actually be affected by this COVID-19 situation. Now, going on to the third shock, which is rather more complex, the deteriorating China-US relations. Now, you've heard quite a lot about this and about comments made by President Trump in relation to the national security legislation. I'm not a politician. I can't really go into the minds of high-level politicians such as President Trump and Secretary Pompeo. But hearing what he said, sometimes I get to be very upset and concerned. For example, President Trump said the national security law will lead to one country, two systems becoming one country, one system. Now, I just scratch my head. How can that be? I mean, if he had just read the Joint Declaration or the Basic Law, he would realize, even the preamble of the Basic Law points out that the two systems, meaning the socialist system in the mainland of China will not be applied to Hong Kong. Hong Kong will maintain the capitalist system. So we still have socialist system on the mainland of China and capitalist system in Hong Kong. Now, how would national security law affect that? Now, we still have two monetary systems. We still have two financial systems. They continue to exist. But of course, he could well be talking about the erosion of freedom, which is a rather vague term. But even that, I also get concerned and upset. What freedom are we taking away? If you look carefully at the national security legislation, yes, we are taking away freedom. We are taking away freedom of sedition. We are taking away freedom to undermine national security. We are taking away freedom for anybody to be used as pawns against our own country. We are taking away freedom to incite riots and arson. I don't want that freedom. But as I said, I don't really understand politicians. And he said, Hong Kong will no longer be able to compete with free markets. Let the competition come. Let's play on equal terms. Perhaps I should stop here in terms of the politics of it. What is comforting is that notwithstanding all these damaging comments, there has been capital inflow into Hong Kong, amounting to 120 billion Hong Kong dollars. That actually is very clear. Our financial system, our monetary system remain very robust, okay? But don't underestimate Trump and Pompeo in the US, obviously, because now they're actually talking about the weaponization of finance. This is something that is of concern to me. Now, finance, as I mentioned earlier, is the mobilization of money from investors to fundraisers, okay? And you need to use a currency for the purpose of clearing transactions. Of course, if you weaponize it, you can restrict the use of the currency. You can restrict investors from investing in the US or restricting US investors from investing in China and fundraising. You can restrict Chinese enterprises to raise funds in Hong Kong. Yes, certainly they've been talking about that. Delisting Chinese enterprises, listing in the New York Stock Exchange. And you can target individuals, you can target institutions, you can target fundraisers, you can target investors, you can target financial institutions, you can target the government even, if you really want to weaponize it. So all those combinations of targets and weapons can be used by the UN. It's a very strong and powerful arsenal at his disposal. Now, certainly, I really hope that he wouldn't do it, but unfortunately, the mechanism seems to already be in place. You know about the US President's executive order on Hong Kong normalization. I would like you actually to read the first bullet carefully. And this is direct quote from the executive order. China to impose national security legislation on Hong Kong constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat to what? To the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States. I mean, what is the logic of this? Okay, to the extent the US President finds it necessary to declare, he is declaring a national emergency with respect to that threat. Wow, very strong words. You know, I'm afraid. It scared me. So there are quite a lot of this, although I don't quite know the logic behind this. He talked about the, taking away preferential treatment, okay? But fortunately, I can assure you that on the financial front, there is no preferential treatment that he can take away. What can he take away? We have no preferential treatment at all on the financial front. Well, there you are. You have the executive order. And also, you have the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which enables the Secretary of State to pinpoint or to specify foreign persons, and at the same time, impose sanction on those foreign persons if they have done certain things, actions or policy that undermine democratic processes or institutions in Hong Kong. These are, foreign persons that he can name and impose sanctions. And the sanctions include, of course, freezing all their assets. Furthermore, if you are a financial institution that is dealing with these foreign persons, you can also be named. And if you are named, oh my God, the sanctions, there are 10 of them. Just read that bullet point. There are 10 of them. But the more important ones, obviously, is foreign exchange, banking transactions, etc. In other words, if you are a foreign financial institution providing financial services to a foreign person which has been identified as to have helped pass the national security law in Hong Kong or to have undermined the democratic processes in Hong Kong, very general term, meaning very wide powers, then you can forget about doing business at all. All right? So these are very draconian measures, very, very draconian measures. Now, of course, what we're interested in is whether this weaponization of finance in the US would hurt Hong Kong. As I said, there is a powerful arsenal at their disposal. And I think it is unlikely for the US to be using the nuclear option, which is to deny, for example, to deny Hong Kong as a whole in the use of the US dollar. I'll tell you why later on, because I think there are significant downside risks for the US if they were to weaponize finance and make use of these sort of weapons. And I would draw your attention to what Stephen Roach said in an article that he wrote. He said, the era of the US dollar's exorbitant privilege as the world primary reserve currency is coming to an end. Now that is the crux of the matter. That is the risk that the US face if they abuse their exorbitant privilege. Now, I have a table here to show you what is called a net international investment position, okay? Obviously, if you invest more than you borrow from the rest of the world, then you have a net investment position, a positive position. But if you have borrowed more than you invest in the rest of the world, then you have a negative position. The United States is way at the bottom. It's a debtor country. It has borrowed money on a net basis amounting to 12 trillion US dollars. The next one is Spain, only 1 trillion. By far, the US dollar is the largest debtor in the world. If you look up at the table, the largest creditor is Japan. But if you add Hong Kong to China, Hong Kong obviously being part of China, we have a net creditor position of 3.7 trillion, which is more than Japan. Now imagine the largest debtor of the world imposing restrictions on the use of its currency, be it the international currency of the world, imposing those restrictions on the largest creditor of the world. I mean, I find it difficult to comprehend as to why the US would be doing this. In brief, they would be asking for trouble, I think. If you look at this time series trend of the US net international investment position, that's really going down. As I mentioned, it's 12 trillion now in the first quarter of 2020. So that chart, the end of it, is falling further and further. And furthermore, if you look at what I call the macroeconomic scorecard of the United States. Now, I'm not an economics professor, I'm a part-time one anyway. But if you look at these numbers, just look at these numbers, the debt to GDP ratio, the unemployment rate, the budget deficit, the net national savings rate, and the fact that the central bank is monetizing budget deficits. Those are cardinal sins that you don't want to commit in running an economy. And they're doing all of that, almost all of that. Look at that scorecard. And if I was sitting on a desk at the IMF, monitoring the performance of these economies, and look at that scorecard, and block out the United States of America on top, I would say that the currency of that country would evaporate easily. But we're talking about the United States of America. Anyway, okay, to conclude, let us take a look briefly at the strategy for Hong Kong as an IFC going forward. We have to continue to focus on what we want to do, okay? Mobilization of money from those who have it to those in need between the mainland of China and the rest of the world. Focus on that. Continue to focus on that, okay? Now, despite worsening China-US relations, the demand for financial intermediation will continue to grow because China is the second largest economy in the world. Its financial needs in terms of investment, in terms of fundraising, will grow. The rest of the world will have to deal with China, okay? If they are quarreling, perhaps it's even better for Hong Kong, but I don't really want them to be quarreling. If they're quarreling and don't deal directly with each other, they'll have to come to Hong Kong. Thank you very much, right? Second point, fintech. As I said, there'll be a new normal after the COVID-19, involving much less interaction between people, and therefore it may be a new normal that financial institutions will have to think very carefully about. I just often raise the question as to whether or not you need so many bank branches. If no one of us, except the old people, they still need to be served. I think we don't go to banks, do we? Well, very seldom anyway. The third point, the internationalization of the renminbi. Now, I just want to be very brief here. If I was sitting in Beijing and looking at the weaponization of finance by the United States, I would want to be less dependent on the US dollar, okay? And that obviously leads to the argument for further internationalizing the renminbi. Now, as an offshore financial center doing just that, we have to push along by introducing the renminbi into the capital markets in Hong Kong, making use of it, for example, in stock market trading. It is possible, okay? The last point is, of course, GBA finance. Let's focus on that. There is an international dimension as well because other people wanting to benefit from the economic development of the Greater Bay Area would need to come to Hong Kong, and that would help our status as an international financial center. I have used up my time. Thank you very much.